Before we finish with the section of videos on sentence structure, I wanted to make sure that we combine all the discussion we had about commas into one video, because over the last set of videos, we've mentioned commas a lot of times in different contexts, different sentence structures. I want to make sure we can bring it all together because comma questions are really common on the test. So first, let's look at some sentences that use commas incorrectly and talk about how we would fix them. The most popular dog in the United States is the Labrador Retriever. Here, what is the function of this comma? Is it separating two independent clauses? No. Is it separating a dependent clause from an independent clause? No. Is it separating an independent clause from a phrase or a relative clause? No. From a positive phrase? No. This comma is doing nothing. Well, it's doing something actually kind of bad. It's separating the subject of our sentence from the verb, and there's no reason you would ever do that. So in this sentence, we would get rid of the comma. I ate Thanksgiving dinner and fell asleep. So we talked about this in one of the first lecture videos when we were talking about coordination. And if you're going to use a comma here to connect these two sentences, this has got to be a complete sentence, which it's not without a subject. So if you added I in here, that would work. I ate Thanksgiving dinner, comma, and I fell asleep. If you didn't want to repeat the I because it was redundant and it is kind of wordy, you can get rid of the comma and then you have, remember that fancy phrase, compound predicate, but basically two actions combined into one, right? I ate Thanksgiving dinner and fell asleep, no problem. So either get rid of the comma, probably the better option, or if you want to keep the comma, you got to add a subject into that second sentence. Hercule Poirot, Captain Hastings, and Inspector Japp arrived just in time to stop the murder. So we have this list of things, and then suddenly after the end, in the final element of our list, we've got a comma. No good. We don't need that comma here. Certainly we need commas to separate members of a list, but that comma after end just doesn't seem to make sense in this context, especially if we don't have a comma, later in the sentence. If this was some sort of inserted phrase, maybe we would have a comma later, but this is one of those two commas or none type of situation. This is just hanging out there doing nothing, no function to it, so we get rid of it. The team that won the game and the one that lost should receive equal praise. Here we have this long compound subject, right? This is all the subject of the verb should receive. And here we separated our compound subject, our two subjects in one with a comma. Again, in none of our videos previously did we talk about using commas to separate a subject from a subject in a situation like this. Suman Seth, a professor of science and technology studies at Cornell University, wrote a book about Arnold Sommerfeld. So there's two ways to look at this one. If we wanted to make this non-essential, if this wasn't really important to the meaning of the sentence, we could have two commas here, but it's weird to have the comma after the studies instead of being after Cornell University. Because again, if you remove this from the sentence, you get something a bit strange. Suman Seth at Cornell University wrote a book about Arnold Sommerfeld. I mean, it's not terrible, but we've lost something which seems to me to be somewhat important, which is that he's a professor at Cornell University. So two ways to go about doing it is either you get rid of the commas completely, although maybe you couldn't do that with a professor. No, I'm going to take that back. The best way to handle this is move this comma after Cornell University, and now the core of the sentence is much easier to understand. Suman Seth wrote a book about Arnold Sommerfeld. Straight up, this middle phrase in here is an appositive phrase defining who this person is, and we would just want to include at Cornell University as part of that. My beagle loves to play with many dog toys, such as squeaky tigers, tug ropes, and tennis balls. This comma right here is kind of optional, either way you want it. Doesn't really matter that much. This comma here is the problem, though. We would never have a comma to separate such as from squeaky tigers and from the rest of its list. So when you're introducing a list, the same thing would be true of something like including or for example. You would never have a comma after that, so we would get rid of this comma. I'm not sure why the law that punishes jaywalking is enforced. Remember, when we use that is essential. It's the relative pronoun we use with the essential relative clauses. And here, since it's essential, we don't want commas at all. So we would get rid of these commas and everything would be fine. If we wanted this to be non-essential, we would have to change this to which and leave the commas in place. But either one is fine. I think the better correction is just get rid of the commas and you're good to go. Mario moved on to World 2-1 because the princess was in another castle. So this is going back to some sentence structure issues. Here is an independent clause. Here is a dependent clause starting with the word because. And remember, when that dependent clause comes after the independent clause, we don't need a comma here. So delete that comma. Ice hockey, a sport that is very popular in Canada, is not as popular in the United States. This is our two or none rule in action, right? This isn't a positive phrase, right? Here's the verb, main verb of the sentence. So if we've got a comma here, we need a comma here. So ice hockey, positive phrase, a sport that is very popular in Canada, is not as popular in the United States. Note if I just read the sentence by itself without the phrase, I would get something that makes sense. Ice hockey is not as popular in the United States. Fine. So we need to have two commas here. So we would add a comma in that position. So let's talk about commas generally now that we've run through some additional examples. The first thing I want to get out of the way is sometimes you might have heard the rule maybe sometime in the past when you were taking English in middle school or something, or maybe even in high school or elsewhere you heard this. You heard the helpful hint, use a comma when the reader pauses or takes a breath. And I think that as a beginner rule, that's okay. It gets you somewhat used to the rhythm and the sense of structure in a sentence, but it's really inadequate for the SAT, for real life, because that makes it seem like comma use is arbitrary, that it's dependent on how you choose to read a sentence, and it's not at all. Comma usage is not arbitrary. There are clear rules to follow, and we've seen a bunch already. Some other facts that are important here. A long sentence doesn't necessarily need a comma, right? So this sentence right here is a perfectly fine sentence in terms of its punctuation. Just because it's really long doesn't mean it needs a comma anywhere, right? It's about how the sentence is constructed. Now, that's not to say that this is a good sentence. I think it's an ugly sentence, but grammatically it doesn't need a comma. The woman who bought a car dealership next to the house where I grew up has decided, after much thought, to convert the business that had previously sold brand new BMWs into one that specializes primarily in selling used cars in order to appeal to a market that no longer has the disposable income nor the desire to own a luxury vehicle. So it's a terrible sentence in many ways, but it's not terrible because it's missing a comma. A comma really honestly wouldn't save the sentence. It's still a mouthful, but commas have nothing to do with length, have nothing to do with breaths and pauses and something subjective. There are rules, and we've covered a lot already, but let's review them so you have a nice tight little list that you can refer to. So the first one is coordinate two independent clauses with a fanboys conjunction. We saw this pretty much the first thing we saw, right? The book was very long, comma, so it took me 3 years to finish, right? Coordinating conjunction, separating two complete sentences with a comma. Separate a subordinate and an independent clause in that order. We've discussed this previously. Even though Randy offered me $2 million, here is the dependent clause. I declined to sell him my favorite paperclip. Here's the independent clause, and here is the comma, separating them. Remember, if it's flipped, if it's I declined to sell him my favorite paperclip even though Randy offered me $2 million, we would not use a comma. Set off participial phrases from the main sentence, either at the beginning or the end, when and if they refer to the subject. And we've seen this in the participial phrases video. Waiting for the signal, comma, Anton readied his water balloon. Bradley ran away from the velociraptor, comma, praying that it had not seen him. So here, this participial phrase is at the end of the sentence, and since the comma is there, it's telling us that this refers to Bradley, not to the velociraptor. If there is no comma, it actually makes it technically apply to the velociraptor. So the sentence would literally be saying that the velociraptor was praying that it had not seen him. Of course, that makes no logical sense, but grammatically, in the literal reading of the sentence, that's what it would be saying. So this is a situation where you probably would want to add a comma to indicate that it's referring to Bradley so that there's no misplaced modifier issues. You can also use a comma to set off small introductory words and phrases like however and in fact, typically from the beginning of the sentence. You can also, if they're in the middle of the sentence, you can also use them with two commas. So for example, in conclusion, I see no flaw with your plan. Finally, put your computer in the microwave. You could have a third example, something like, it was determined, however, that we should go to the mall. In that however, your however would be between two commas if it's in the middle of the sentence. Again, it's that two or none rule, which we can summarize. I mean, note in all these examples, except for part of number 4, we used one comma to separate clauses and phrases from the beginning and the end of the sentence, right? Or to separate entire sentences from one another. So we use one comma when we're adding things to the beginning and the end of sentences, whether it's a phrase or another whole sentence. We use a single comma to do that. In the following couples of examples, we're going to look at ones where you're using two commas. So this is the two or none rule. And the main one for two commas, of course, is when you've got non-restrictive, or we've been using the phrase non-essential clauses and phrases, whether they're participial, relative, and a positive, you use two commas. So, for example, to review, the ACT, a test that previously placed second to the SAT, finally surpassed its competitor last year. This is our positive phrase referring back to the ACT, describing it, and we would use commas around it. The document, which has not yet been released to the public, clearly shows that Steve Jobs stole the idea for the iPod from Martians. So here we have got a relative clause, a which relative clause, which is referring back to the document, and we put it in between commas. The final use for commas that really matters for us, we've seen this previously, is to separate members of a list. So, I enjoy swimming, dancing, and watching movies, and the robber smashed the window, entered the house, and saw the Rottweiler. Remember, with these two considerations, one, sometimes you use semicolons to separate members of a list if using commas would be confusing. Again, I don't think that's really something we have to worry about for this test, but we will keep it in mind. And then remember, when you've got a list, they've got to be parallel. So they are, in this case, right, all of these verbs are in the same past tense form. So everything is nicely balanced. Let's take a look at a few examples from test number 1 to really put everything together, put all our punctuation, put all our comma stuff together. Number 4, they can add it to livestock feed as a protein supplement, and people can make their own Greek-style yogurt at home by straining regular yogurt. If it is improperly introduced into the environment, acid-way runoff can pollute waterways, depleting the oxygen content of streams and rivers as it decomposes. Here we go. Yogurt manufacturers, food scientists, and government officials are also working together to develop additional solutions for reusing whey. Here we've got a semicolon, but remember, with semicolons, you have to have a complete sentence on both sides of the semicolon, and this is not at all a complete sentence. You might say, well, isn't this separating members of a list? Well, maybe, but notice we used a comma earlier to do that. So we want to be consistent and just use a comma here. This is the rule to separate the members of your list with commas. B uses a colon. Again, we can't use a colon or a semicolon unless that first sentence at the very least is a complete sentence. D is good because it uses a comma, but then it throws a comma after end. And we saw this explicitly in one of the examples. You don't need a comma after the end to complete your list. So this one would be C. 15. But Jason Box, an associate professor of geology at Ohio State, believes that another factor added to the early thaw, the dark snow problem. So here we've got this noun, Jason Box, and then we've got a positive phrase, an associate professor at Ohio State. Currently, we only have one comma. This is where the two or no comma rule comes in. Either we're going to have two here or we're going to have none, and almost certainly going to have two with a positive phrases like this. So we can get rid of A. B only has one comma right there. C has got two, and D has got two, but this is very similar to that Suman Seth Cornell University example. We need these commas to be surrounding the entire appositive, not just a portion of it, right? So really it will be choice C, because we want the phrase to be, but Jason Box, comma, an associate professor of geology at Ohio State, comma, believes that blah, 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 blah. So for this one, we would go with choice C. Last one we'll take a look at is 26. The spaces are usually stocked with standard office equipment, such as photocopiers, printers, and fax machines. So we're introducing a list. This comma after equipment doesn't really matter that much, so we don't really care either way. The original honestly looks pretty good on this. I mean, we have equipment, comma, such as, and it goes into the examples. With B and C, the comma after equipment doesn't really matter as much as the fact that we're introducing this semicolon or this colon, and we don't need that colon there, right? This using such as introduces the list just fine. If we put a colon there, the sentence before it with the such as really isn't a complete thought, right? The spaces are usually stocked with standard office equipment such as. Is that a complete sentence? Is that a complete thought? Not really. So we can get rid of C. And then with D, we've got a comma after the such as, which we talked about before, we don't need. So this one would be choice A.